"You do not belong here." The words came out cold and sharp from Mark's mouth, cutting through the air the second Isabel stepped into the grand ballroom of the Grand Regency Hotel. The Golden Crest Group was celebrating its 50th anniversary, and the hall was alive with the glitter of crystal chandeliers and the hum of artificial smiles. The orchestra's melody seemed to falter for a moment, as if even the violins understood the bitter weight of that humiliation. A few guests turned their heads out of curiosity, while others pretended not to notice. But everyone nearby heard enough to know that the woman standing before Mark was no ordinary intruder. Isabel stood completely frozen, her fingers tightening around the small beige clutch pressed against her chest. Mark took a step toward her, his eyes dark with irritation, while a woman in a fitted crimson dress stood beside him, watching the scene unfold with a subtle smile, far too calculating to be innocent and far too satisfied to be polite. The silence lengthened as Mark lowered his voice, though his tone remained harsh enough for those nearby to catch every word. He leaned in closer to Isabel and reminded her that he had been extremely clear on the phone, that she should have stayed home, and that this was no place for scenes or for someone who did not know how to conduct herself among important people. Isabel opened her lips to respond, but no sound came out. There were humiliations that burned so deeply from within that they turned a person's voice to stone. Meanwhile, the woman in the crimson dress stepped forward, lightly resting her hand on Mark's arm, while casting an evaluating glance over Isabel, as though inspecting an out-of-style coat forgotten in the back window of an old thrift shop. If you believe that the truth always finds a way to reveal itself, then stay with this story until the end, because on that very night, the woman everyone wanted to hide would become the only person impossible to ignore. Just a few hours before the gala, Isabel was still at home in her modest apartment on the west side of Chicago, trying to decide whether she would spend the evening working on a medical translation project or simply go to bed early to avoid thinking about the marriage crumbling right before her eyes. Mark had left shortly after lunch, wearing a brand-new suit and a cologne he reserved exclusively for occasions when he needed to make a strong impression. He had mentioned casually that the company's anniversary gala was extremely important and that she did not need to attend, as it would be a long evening filled with board members, press, and corporate matters she would not care for. Isabel had tried to smile, the way she always did whenever she felt herself being quietly pushed out of her husband's life, and asked if he was sure. Without even looking at her directly, Mark replied that sometimes having a spouse tag along ended up hurting a man's presence more than helping it. That answer was no isolated accident. It was the result of months of small cuts, quiet dismissals, and lingering absences that together had wounded her far more than an outright betrayal ever could. Isabel had known Mark long before his success at the Golden Crest Group, back when he was merely a promising low-level manager with ambition burning in his eyes and deep insecurity hidden in his voice. She had stood by him when his paycheck barely covered the rent, writing reports for him late into the night, editing his slide presentations, and listening in silence to every fear he had of never being accepted by the powerful men who ran the corporation. Over time, that anxious young man slowly disappeared, and in his place emerged someone obsessed with status, social validation, and the belief that everything in life could be negotiated, including his respect for the woman who stayed by his side when no one else believed in him. At 4 o'clock in the afternoon, when Isabel had almost convinced herself to stay home, someone rang the doorbell with a gentle, almost hesitant persistence. Standing on the other side of the door was Arthur, an elderly man with silver hair who had worked for decades as a driver for the former administrator of the Chicago orphanage where Isabel was raised. He was holding a dark, aged wooden box with worn edges, looking nervous, as though he were delivering something that weighed far more than its physical size. Arthur explained that Mrs. Clara, Isabel's foster mother, who had passed away 3 months earlier, had left strict instructions that the box was only to be delivered on an important night, a night when someone would attempt to stop Isabel from going to a place where she truly needed to be. Isabel felt a sudden ache at the mention of the woman who raised her and invited Arthur inside, but the old driver declined, saying his mission ended right there. Left alone in the living room, Isabel opened the box with trembling fingers and found 3 items that seemed entirely unrelated, yet somehow wove a secret history together. There was a black and gold invitation to the Golden Crest Group's 50th anniversary gala, bearing a special access pass to the executive suite. Alongside it lay an old, slightly faded photograph of a young woman with dark hair, a serene smile, and eyes so similar to Isabel's that for a second she felt as though she were looking at her own reflection aged by time. The third object was a delicate, clearly expensive pendant shaped like a stylized fleur-de-lis, resting on a fine gold chain. Folded into 4 sections at the very bottom of the box was a short note written in Mrs. Clara's familiar handwriting. "If anyone ever tries to make you believe you belong nowhere, take these to the person who recognizes them first." Isabel reread the note several times, feeling an old sense of confusion rise within her like dust stirred up in an empty room. She had grown up knowing only that she had been left as an infant at a charitable clinic in rural Illinois following a sudden fire that destroyed the facility's records. Mrs. Clara used to tell her that some stories take time to unfold because the truth needs to find a person at the right moment. And whenever Isabel pressed for details, the answer came in the form of affection. Never answers. Now, staring at the photograph and the gold pendant, the absence of answers felt less like a protective gesture and more like the missing piece of a puzzle someone had put together in the dark. For a few minutes, she considered calling Mark to tell him what she had found, but she hesitated. Lately, any topic that did not revolve around his climbing career was treated as an inconvenient burden on his time. Mark's call came shortly after 6 in the evening. As Isabel stood looking at the invitation, still undecided, his voice came through the speaker faster and sharper than usual, as if he were pacing down a quiet hallway in a hurry. He asked where she was, demanded to know if she had understood what he told her earlier, and reinforced that he did not want to see her at the venue under any circumstances. Isabel tried to ask why, but Mark cut her off with irritation and dropped the words that hurt her the most. "Stay away from the party, Isabel. You'll only embarrass me." The line went dead immediately, leaving behind a silence so heavy in the apartment that she had to rest her hand against the kitchen table to steady herself. That statement did not feel like a simple lack of love. It sounded like fear, and, for the very first time, Isabel realized her husband did not want to keep her away, because he felt ashamed of her, but because he was terrified of something that might happen if she actually showed up. Instead of breaking down into tears as she would have months ago, Isabel took a warm shower, dried her hair carefully, and chose a simple navy blue dress, elegant, refined, and completely free of the flashy sparkle common among the women who frequented society magazines. She fastened the gold pendant around her neck almost without thinking, as though the object had naturally found the exact place where it belonged, and slipped the photograph and the note safely into her clutch. Looking into the mirror as she applied a touch of lipstick, she noticed how different her eyes appeared that evening, no longer just tired, but focused and clear. A quiet resolve was taking root within her, a new determination to stop running from the question that had followed her since childhood. Who was she before she became just an unnamed girl raised in a charitable home? When the rideshare arrived, Isabel took a deep breath and stepped outside, unaware that she was crossing a threshold far greater than the city limits. The Grand Regency Hotel glowed like a cut gem in the heart of downtown Chicago. Its illuminated facade cast warm reflections across the sleek luxury cars, floor-length gowns, and sharp tuxedos moving along the red carpet at the entrance. Isabel felt the weight of several curious glances the moment she walked into the lobby and handed her special invitation to the head of security. He checked the name printed on the card, double-checked a detail on his earpiece, and, to her surprise, stepped aside with a deferential bow that she had not anticipated. Inside the grand ballroom, soft jazz floated through the room. Trays of champagne moved seamlessly from hand to hand, and the crest of the Golden Crest Group decorated every corner of the venue. A massive gallery wall displayed photographs documenting the corporation's history, tracing its rise from a small family manufacturing firm into a multi-billion-dollar enterprise. Isabel moved forward cautiously, taking in the grand setting like someone entering a world that had previously existed only in the stories her husband used to tell when he still enjoyed sharing his life with her. It did not take long for her to spot Mark. He was standing near the main stage, smiling at a group of senior executives while holding a glass of sparkling wine, and beside him stood the woman in the crimson dress, striking, flawless, and completely relaxed, her hand resting on his arm with a familiarity that suggested it was a routine gesture. The moment Mark caught sight of Isabel, the smile vanished from his face, replaced by an expression so cold it caused her stomach to drop. He crossed the floor with hurried steps, ignoring the curious glances of those around him, and intercepted her before she could say a single word. The scent of his cologne, once so familiar and comforting, now felt distant and harsh. Disdain was clear in his eyes, but behind it lay something deeper, a nervous, almost frantic edge that Isabel could not quite make sense of right away. Mark guided her toward a quiet corner near a tall arrangement of white orchids, trying to keep his voice down, though his tense posture betrayed every word. He asked if she had lost her mind, demanded to know if she realized the magnitude of what she was doing, and questioned whether she was trying to ruin everything he had worked so hard to build over the years. Isabel answered with a composure she did not know she possessed, saying she had not come to start an argument, but merely to return items that might belong to the right family. Mark knitted his brows in frustration, but, before he could demand an explanation, the woman in red approached with a polished smile. She introduced herself as Evelyn Vance, the company's director of communications, and offered a polite nod while remarking that she had heard quite a bit about Isabel. She then tilted her head slightly, adding in a tone far too light to be genuine that she had pictured someone a bit different, perhaps someone more accustomed to such environments. Isabel recognized the subtle trap in the comment and simply asked if Mark would mind introducing her properly, considering she was his wife. Evelyn raised her eyebrows in theatrical surprise and let out a soft laugh, as if she had just heard an amusing piece of childish lingering. Mark closed his eyes for a fraction of a second, clearly bothered less by the cruelty of the remark than by the risk of drawing unwanted attention from the surrounding crowd. Evelyn then commented that certain corporate positions required a particular image, pedigree, and presence, qualities that could open doors where romantic affection alone never could. She added that the Golden Crest Group was an unforgiving world where individuals without established backgrounds often found themselves out of place. The remark was delivered like an elegant social observation, but it struck Isabel directly against the old wound of not knowing where she came from. Even so, she did not defend herself. She simply reached up and touched the pendant at her collarbone, like someone recalling an essential truth. Mark caught the movement, and the color instantly drained from his face. It was not a subtle change, but a sharp, involuntary shock that revealed unmistakable prior knowledge. His eyes locked onto the pendant for far too long, and Isabel noted his reaction with absolute clarity. When she asked directly if he recognized the piece, Mark recovered quickly, stammering that it looked like cheap antique costume jewelry from a thrift store and nothing more, though his words came out rushed and fragile. Evelyn also inspected the necklace with intense curiosity before stepping away for a moment, as if to alert someone nearby. Isabel realized then that she was surrounded by people who seemed to know far more about her past than she did, and the humiliation she had felt upon arrival began to give way to a cold, painful clarity. The entire evening was built upon a secret she had never been allowed to see. The Master of Ceremonies called for quiet, announcing the arrival of Arthur Sterling, the founder and senior chairman of the group. The man whose face appeared regularly in business journals and whose signature carried immense weight walked onto the stage. The entire room turned toward him. Despite his advanced years, he moved with a firm posture and a quiet authority that commanded instant respect. Chairman Sterling began his address by speaking of legacy, family, and endurance, words that sounded strange to Isabel, given how everything in the room seemed to contradict the idea of family. Mark took advantage of the crowd's distraction to quietly order Isabel to leave the hotel immediately. Isabel replied that she would leave the moment she found someone capable of recognizing the items inside her clutch. He tried to grab her wrist to pull her away, but she stepped back gracefully, and as she raised her arm, the gold pendant caught the overhead light. At that exact instant, Chairman Sterling looked out across the audience, and the glass he was holding slipped from his fingers, shattering against the marble floor before anyone could understand what had happened. The sharp sound of breaking glass echoed through the hall, causing conversations to stop instantly. The chairman of the Golden Crest Group stood frozen on stage, staring directly at Isabel as if he had just seen a ghost walk into the room. Mark froze where he stood. Evelyn took a step back, and the senior executives nearby exchanged confused looks, uncertain whether they should rush to help their leader or pretend nothing had occurred. Without asking for assistance, Chairman Sterling stepped down from the platform and began walking straight across the room, completely ignoring corporate protocol. Breathing heavily, his focus remained entirely on Isabel. Isabel felt her heart pounding against her ribs, overwhelmed by an inexplicable feeling that this powerful man was not looking at a stranger, but at someone whose long absence had shaped his entire life. When Chairman Sterling finally stopped in front of her, his eyes were glistening, and the hand he raised toward the pendant trembled in a way that seemed entirely out of place for a man accustomed to directing major enterprises. He touched the gold detail with the very tips of his fingers, as if verifying that something impossible had come true. He looked closely at Isabel's face, tracing her features, the line of her jaw, the shape of her brows, and the distinct shade of her eyes. He whispered a name beneath his breath first, as though the word brought both pain and relief. Elizabeth. A second later, he spoke clearly enough for those nearby to hear. After all these years, I have finally found you. A collective breath seemed to hold across the immediate circle of guests, while Isabel could barely ask what he meant. Chairman Sterling addressed her as the daughter of his late child, a connection she had never heard associated with her own life. But spoken by him, the name carried an immense weight of memory and long-held regret. Mark reacted far too quickly for a confused spouse. He stepped directly between them, asserting in a forced, controlled tone that there had to be a mistake, that his wife was simply wearing a common antique necklace, and that it meant nothing at all. Chairman Sterling turned to him with a cold severity, asking Mark how long he had known about the woman standing beside him. The question hit like an invisible blade. Isabel turned slowly toward her husband, waiting for an immediate denial, a genuine look of confusion, or any sign of innocence. Instead, Mark hesitated. It was only a brief pause, but it was more than enough to expose the truth. He claimed he knew nothing, claiming he was just as surprised as everyone else, yet his clenched fists and rigid posture told an entirely different story. Chairman Sterling requested a private conference room, stating firmly that the matter would not be discussed in the middle of a crowded ballroom. As security personnel quietly guided curious onlookers away, Isabel felt the tension of the evening tightening around her. Evelyn tried to intervene, suggesting that the situation was highly improper and that opportunistic individuals often preyed on the emotional vulnerabilities of elderly figures. Chairman Sterling silenced her with a single look, treating her hostility as inconsequential. Isabel opened her clutch and handed the old photograph to the chairman. He brought the image close, his expression shifting to deep shock, and revealed with a strained voice that the young woman in the photo was his daughter, Helena, who had disappeared decades ago. A quiet murmur rippled through the lingering guests, as the story of the chairman's missing daughter had long been treated as a distant corporate rumor buried under years of silence. Chairman Sterling asked where Isabel had obtained the photo and the pendant, and she explained everything about the box left by Mrs. Clara, the note, and the request to deliver them to whoever recognized them first. The chairman closed his eyes for a long moment, piecing together painful fragments of a past that had never truly stopped hurting. He explained to the small group remaining that the pendant was a unique piece commissioned specifically for his daughter in her youth, and that Helena had left the family while expecting a child after a bitter falling out over a personal relationship he had refused to sanction. Sometime later, the family received word that she had perished in a fire at a small medical clinic in rural Illinois, but the records were destroyed and no positive identification was ever made. Alvin Vance, who served as chief legal counsel for the firm at the time, was tasked with verifying the reports and concluded that neither Helena nor the infant had survived. Isabel felt a chill run down her spine upon hearing the name Alvin Vance. He was Evelyn's father, the former head of legal affairs. Isabel placed the photograph on the table and asked why no one had ever come looking for her at the orphanage. Chairman Sterling replied that he had pursued leads for years, but the clinic's records had vanished, and regional authorities provided conflicting reports. Over time, false leads and anonymous demands for money exhausted the search, leading the board to pressure him into halting the formal inquiry, though he continued to fund private searches in secret. Isabel then produced the dossier that had fallen from her clutch and asked if it was one of his private reports. The chairman examined the pages carefully and shook his head, noting that the document bore the seal of a private security firm retained directly by Alvin Vance's private office, and that several notes in the margins were written in Mark's distinct handwriting. A quiet anger settled over Chairman Sterling as he looked at Mark, no longer displaying shock, but the cold fury of a man confronting betrayal. Isabel took the dossier back, reading through lines that proved her life had been monitored long before that night. There were dates, addresses, medical records, school documents from the orphanage, and names of people she had spoken to in recent months. The most devastating realization was that Mark had known all along. The man she shared her home with had been quietly documenting her identity as if she were a strategic asset rather than his wife. In a barely audible voice, Isabel asked him how long he had known. Mark opened his mouth, closed it again, and looked around the room as if searching for an exit that no longer existed. Evelyn quietly stepped back, distancing herself from the situation. Chairman Sterling asked everyone else to leave the room, but Isabel could no longer follow anyone's lead. Her entire world felt reduced to the dossier in her hands and the realization that her husband had tried to keep her away from the gala because he knew precisely who she was. It was not social embarrassment or class differences that had driven him. It was the fear of losing control, the terror that she would be recognized before he could decide how to leverage the truth for his own benefit. Isabel looked up at Mark, and for the first time in years, she did not see the man she loved or the difficult partner she kept trying to support. She saw a stranger, an ambitious, calculating man whose silence concealed motives far more dangerous than simple neglect. Chairman Sterling gently asked Isabel to accompany him to a private executive office, where they could speak without interruption and verify the details with complete discretion. She took a deep breath, clutching the pendant against her skin, sensing that the gold piece was no longer just an old keepsake, but the key that had unlocked every door previously closed to her. Mark attempted to object, claiming that any hasty decisions could spark a public scandal and harm the company's standing. But Chairman Sterling cut him off, remarking that the only real scandal was discovering that one of his managers had been hiding information regarding a potential family heir. Isabel walked beside the chairman without a word, holding the dossier tightly against her chest, carrying the painful realization that her life had been manipulated by people who had never viewed her as a human being. Before passing through the double doors, she turned back one last time and saw Mark standing beside Evelyn, rigid and stripped of his polished facade. The party outside continued, but the laughter had faded. Guests offered quiet whispers while stealing glances in their direction. Isabel understood that her life was now split into two distinct chapters: the woman who had entered the hotel expecting nothing more than dismissal from her husband, and the woman walking out knowing she belonged to a family that had looked for her for decades. As the door closed behind her, one central question remained. If Mark already knew who she was, why had he kept it hidden? And what had he planned to do before Chairman Sterling recognized her? The heavy door of the private suite shut with a quiet click. Chairman Sterling asked his aides to wait outside and gestured toward a leather armchair near the window, but Isabel remained standing, keeping the dossier pressed against her chest as she observed the man who had always seemed so distant in news reports. The chairman remained standing as well, uncertain of how to bridge the gap between them. Before finally admitting that he did not expect her to trust him after everything that had transpired, Isabel asked directly why he had called her Elizabeth. Chairman Sterling took a deep breath and explained that Elizabeth was the name Helena had chosen for her daughter before she disappeared. He opened a small built-in drawer and retrieved a preserved photograph of Helena wearing the exact same fleur-de-lis pendant. The resemblance was striking, not just in physical features, but in the quiet resilience visible in the eyes of the young woman in the print. He shared that Helena was 23 when she fell in love with a junior maintenance technician at the firm, a man named Daniel who lacked an influential family name or financial standing. At the time, Chairman Sterling had viewed the relationship as an unacceptable risk, pressuring his daughter and offering Daniel money to walk away. Helena chose to leave instead, cutting ties with the family entirely. Months later, the family learned she was expecting. But before any reconciliation could occur, news arrived of the clinic fire in Illinois, and Alvin Vance reported that no survivors were found. I spent nearly 30 years believing I had lost my daughter without ever having the chance to say goodbye. Chairman Sterling said quietly. Isabel felt a cold sensation settle over her as she connected the names. Alvin Vance was Evelyn's father, the man who had handled the official report. She placed the photograph back on the table and asked why no one had ever found her at the orphanage. The chairman explained that early records had been destroyed, and subsequent inquiries yielded conflicting information, while board members repeatedly urged him to cease spending corporate resources on what they considered a lost cause. Isabel opened the dossier and asked if the document was part of those early searches. Chairman Sterling reviewed the pages carefully and confirmed it was not. The paperwork originated from a private agency retained directly by Alvin Vance's personal account, with marginal notes written by Mark. He offered to arrange a formal DNA test, explaining it was the only definitive way to establish their legal relationship. Isabel listened in silence. But the concept of family offered little immediate comfort. After a lifetime of wondering about her origins, the potential answer arrived entangled with corporate power, a deceitful husband, and an aging man seeking redemption. "I am not a ghost from your past," Isabel said firmly, "and I am not a replacement for the daughter you lost." Chairman Sterling lowered his head, acknowledging her words, and asked only for the opportunity to establish the truth without expecting immediate affection or obligation. Isabel neither accepted nor declined, stating she needed time to think and intended to speak with Mark before making any decisions. Mark was waiting anxiously in the corridor outside, while Evelyn spoke quietly on her phone a short distance away. The moment Isabel stepped out, Mark took her arm and guided her toward the private elevator. On the way down, he pressed her for details regarding what Chairman Sterling had said and whether she had agreed to any testing. Isabel remained silent, watching his reflection in the polished metal panel. Noticing that his concern was entirely focused on managing the fallout rather than her well-being. When they reached the lower garage, Mark insisted that the entire situation was merely the confusion of an elderly man overwhelmed by guilt, warning that wealthy families often destroyed anyone who attempted to interfere with their estates. "I'm only trying to protect you," he insisted, using the same gentle tone he had used years ago. Isabel looked at him directly and asked why he had conducted a secret investigation into her background without ever mentioning it. Mark looked away, claiming he would explain everything once they were home. The drive back to their apartment was defined by a heavy silence. Mark drove quickly, his grip tightening on the wheel whenever Isabel brought up the dossier. Eventually, he claimed that an anonymous tip had reached his department 8 months earlier, suggesting a potential link between Isabel and the Sterling family. He insisted he had chosen to investigate quietly to protect her from being used in corporate schemes, and had avoided telling her to prevent false hopes. Isabel asked why the reports had been routed to Alvin Vance instead of Chairman Sterling directly. Mark replied that Vance was a senior board member who handled sensitive legal matters quietly. The explanation sounded rehearsed, leaving far too many unanswered questions. When they arrived home, Mark attempted to put his arm around her, promising they would navigate the situation together. But Isabel stepped back. The gesture felt entirely calculated. The following morning, Mark prepared breakfast and tried to act as though the events at the hotel were merely a regrettable misunderstanding. He mentioned he had consulted with legal counsel and suggested it would be best for her to keep her distance from Chairman Sterling until the legal implications were fully understood. He then placed a folder containing real estate documents on the table, explaining he had been planning to purchase a larger home for them and needed her signature to proceed with the financing. The gesture was designed to appear thoughtful, complete with talks of a fresh start and starting a family, topics he had avoided for months. Isabel slowly flipped through the pages. While some dealt with standard mortgage terms, others contained complex legal language regarding property representation, management of future assets, and power of attorney. She asked why those terms were included in a standard home purchase, and Mark smiled. dismissing it as routine bank paperwork while asking her to trust him. Isabel feigned agreement, asking for time to review the documents carefully on the grounds that she was exhausted. Mark showed a flash of irritation before quickly recovering his calm demeanor and leaving for the office. As soon as he departed, Isabel photographed every page and sent the images to a former law school classmate who now worked at a firm downtown. The response arrived less than an hour later. The clauses granted Mark broad authority to act on her behalf regarding any property. Shares or inheritances acquired during their marriage, including the right to sign waivers in her name. Isabel felt a wave of nausea. The house purchase was merely a cover. Her husband was attempting to secure legal control over any assets that might arise if her connection to the Sterling family was confirmed. While Isabel processed the discovery, Mark was meeting with Evelyn and Alvin Vance in a conference room on the top floor of the corporate headquarters. Vance was furious about the scene at the gala, blaming Mark for failing to keep his wife away. Mark defended himself, stating he had followed the plan and could not have anticipated that Mrs. Clara would leave the pendant to Isabel. Evelyn demanded that Mark secure Isabel's signature before any DNA testing took place, noting that if Isabel were recognized as an heir, her potential voting shares could alter the board's structure and disrupt years of planning. Vance reminded Mark that his path to an executive vice presidency depended entirely on his continued cooperation, subtly adding that once the asset rights were transferred, the marriage would no longer serve a purpose. Evelyn smiled at the comment, while Mark remained silent, appearing briefly unsettled but offering no objection. That afternoon, Isabel decided to search their apartment for answers. Mark had always kept a locked drawer in his home office, claiming it contained confidential corporate contracts that she respected without question. Now, knowing he had been investigating her life, she felt no obligation to respect his privacy. She found a spare key hidden behind old books on a shelf and opened the drawer. Inside were copies of her personal records, photographs taken without her knowledge, and detailed notes regarding Mrs. Clara. She also uncovered records from the clinic fire, incomplete death certificates, and a list of former clinic employees. One name was circled multiple times: Martha Higgins, a nurse on duty the night of the fire. Beside the name, Mark had written, "Located. Has not spoken to Sterling." Isabel realized that Martha Higgins might hold the truth about what happened to Helena and the infant that night. At the bottom of the drawer lay a USB drive. Isabel plugged it into her laptop and found copies of messages exchanged between Mark and Alvin Vance. In one exchange, Vance stated that Helena's daughter needed to be kept away from Chairman Sterling until the upcoming board vote regarding executive authority. In another, Mark asked how much time they had to secure a power of attorney before Isabel became suspicious, to which Vance replied directly, "Use the marriage. She trusts you." Isabel read the sentence repeatedly, feeling a deep sense of loss. For months, she had tried to excuse Mark's growing distance, assuming he was under severe pressure at work. Now she understood that every canceled dinner, every casual question about her past, and every sudden display of affection had been part of a deliberate effort. The marriage she thought was slipping away had been used against her from the start. Yet, a painful question remained. Mark had met her long before he worked closely with Alvin Vance, and long before any investigation into her origins began. There had been a time when he seemed to love her genuinely, and she wondered at what point his ambition had completely overridden his affection. She sat on the office floor surrounded by documents and wept quietly, not just for the marriage she had lost, but for the years she had spent dimming her own presence to help him succeed. When she finished, Isabel copied the entire contents of the flash drive onto her own device and returned the original items to the drawer exactly as she had found them. Before evening, Isabel called Chairman Sterling directly, stating she agreed to undergo DNA testing, but under strict conditions. The procedure had to be conducted at an independent facility unaffordable to corporate influence. Mark and the Vances were not to be informed, and her independent attorney had to be present throughout. Chairman Sterling agreed without hesitation. The test was scheduled for the following morning at a private clinic across town. When Mark returned home that evening, Isabel acted hesitant and subdued, telling him she had thought things over and wanted nothing to do with Chairman Sterling or his family. Mark relaxed immediately and brought up the real estate documents again. Isabel promised she would review and sign them by the end of the week, and the brief kiss he placed on her forehead felt entirely detached. The next morning, Isabel left the apartment under the guise of meeting a translation client, instead meeting Chairman Sterling and her attorney at the designated clinic. The process was straightforward. Blood samples were drawn, labeled, and sealed according to strict protocols. Even so, the air in the room was heavy. Chairman Sterling watched her with quiet hope, while Isabel focused on keeping her expectations grounded. She brought up the name Martha Higgins, and the chairman acknowledged he remembered the nurse, explaining his past investigators had been unable to locate her. Isabel kept Mark's notes to herself, mentioning only that certain individuals within the company might have interfered with previous inquiries. Chairman Sterling recognized the implication and agreed to quietly investigate the matter. The results would take several days, and both agreed to maintain complete discretion until the report was finalized. However, late that afternoon, a call disrupted their plans. The clinic reported a minor electrical fire in the storage wing where processing took place, damaging several samples. Minutes later, Isabel's attorney received word that a regional archive holding older medical records transferred from the Illinois clinic had also experienced a fire that same afternoon. 2 fires affecting related records within 24 hours was no coincidence. Chairman Sterling offered to assign private security to Isabel, but she declined having guards at her apartment, knowing it would alert Mark immediately. Still, the danger felt increasingly immediate. Isabel attempted to call the number listed for Martha Higgins in Mark's notes, but the line went unanswered, and by the following day, it was disconnected entirely. When her attorney visited the address listed in the file, she found the small house empty, with the front door unlocked and signs of a sudden departure. A neighbor mentioned that Martha had been visited by a well-dressed man the previous evening, after which she packed a bag and left in a dark sedan. The description was general, but one detail stood out. The visitor wore a silver signet ring with a black stone, the exact ring Alvin Vance had gifted to Mark following his recent promotion. Isabel felt a cold dread settle over her. While she lacked absolute proof, the sequence of events was becoming impossible to ignore. When Mark arrived home that evening, he appeared entirely composed, asking casually about her day before mentioning that Chairman Sterling seemed to be acting erratically at work. Isabel replied calmly that she had not spoken to the chairman since the gala. Mark watched her face closely for a moment before asking about the real estate papers again, and Isabel assured him she would sign them the following day. Later that night, after Mark had fallen asleep, Isabel received a message from her attorney. Local police had recovered security footage from a street camera near the Medical Archive building. The video showed a vehicle entering the alley shortly before the fire was reported, matching the make and model of Mark's corporate car. Another angle captured a man exiting near the service entrance. His face was obscured, but his build, posture, and the distinct reflection of a ring on his hand matched her husband. Isabel enlarged the image on her phone screen until the details blurred. She could not definitively prove it was Mark in a court of law just yet, but as she looked at him sleeping beside her, she no longer wondered if he was capable of such actions. She wondered only how far he would go to keep the truth concealed. Isabel spent the remainder of the night awake in the living room chair, staring at the enlarged image on her phone, while Mark slept peacefully in the next room. Shortly after dawn, she received a message from Chairman Sterling requesting that she refrain from traveling alone. He had arranged for a secondary DNA collection at a lab in Milwaukee, using coded identifiers and a medical team with zero ties to the Golden Crest Group. Isabel hesitated briefly before confirming she would go. She checked on Mark one last time before leaving. Looking at him as he slept, she felt no trace of nostalgia for the man he used to be, only a quiet vigilance regarding the man he had become. The second test was conducted at a modest facility in Wisconsin, far from corporate oversight. Chairman Sterling arrived accompanied only by Isabel's attorney and an elderly geneticist who was a longtime personal friend. The samples were drawn, sealed, and personally transported by the specialist to an independent laboratory in Minnesota. Isabel monitored every step of the process directly. When the procedure was complete, Chairman Sterling tried to speak about Helena, but Isabel stopped him gently. "I need verified facts before I can accept memories as truth." He nodded in understanding and handed her a folder containing old letters written by Helena before her disappearance. 2 days later, the results were delivered by the geneticist in person. The probability of paternity between Chairman Sterling and Isabel was confirmed at over 99.9%. The report left no room for doubt. She was Helena's daughter and his granddaughter. Chairman Sterling sat in silence for a long moment, processing the confirmation he had sought for decades, before burying his face in his hands. Isabel felt a sudden wave of disorientation rather than immediate relief. Everything she had known about her background had shifted, yet the past remained shrouded in unanswered questions. "The test proves the relation, but it doesn't explain what happened back then," she stated clearly. Chairman Sterling agreed, promising to uncover how she had been separated from her mother, and why the records had been systematically erased. That afternoon, the Sterling family's senior legal advisor, Arthur Faraz, joined them to review the legal parameters of the discovery. He produced a document preserved for nearly 40 years, the original trust framework established by Arthur Sterling's mother, the co-founder of the enterprise. The terms specified that should Helena have any direct descendants, a significant block of voting shares would transfer automatically to that heir upon verified identification. The clause had been included because the matriarch distrusted the ambitions of certain early executives and wished to prevent any single faction from consolidating absolute control. With Isabel's identity confirmed, she was legally the largest individual shareholder in the corporation, holding sufficient voting weight to reshape the board of directors. Chairman Sterling looked at her carefully and noted that while the inheritance represented immense wealth, it was also the primary reason someone had worked so hard to keep her identity hidden. News of the test result leaked to Alvin Vance before Chairman Sterling could secure the formal announcements. The following morning, several financial outlets ran stories questioning Isabel's motives, painting her as an unknown translator attempting to lay claim to a corporate fortune through questionable claims. Photographs of her leaving the initial clinic were circulated online, alongside harsh commentary regarding her background, her strained marriage, and her sudden appearance. Some reports claimed she had used her marriage to Mark to gain access to the firm, while others suggested Chairman Sterling was being manipulated in his old age. Isabel recognized the aggressive PR style typical of the firm's communications department and knew Evelyn was behind the campaign. Shortly after, Mark convened a press briefing outside the corporate headquarters, presenting himself as a concerned husband worried about his wife's emotional state. He claimed Isabel had been struggling with her identity since her foster mother's passing, and that Chairman Sterling had taken advantage of her vulnerability to encourage unrealistic expectations regarding the estate. I love my wife, and my only goal is to ensure she receives proper care before this situation causes her further harm, Mark stated directly to the cameras. Isabel watched the broadcast from her attorney's office, feeling every sentence as a deliberate betrayal. Minutes later, her attorney confirmed that Mark had filed an emergency petition seeking a temporary legal guardianship over Isabel, citing emotional distress and requesting authority over her legal and financial affairs. If granted, the order would give Mark full control over her decisions, effectively neutralizing her ability to claim her position or challenge the board. Isabel did not cry. The severity of the move produced a quiet, sharp focus within her. She met with her legal team, assembling the copied files from the flash drive, the photos of the dossier, the altered real estate terms, and the certified genetic report, while requesting a formal forensic audit of the signature pages Mark had pressed her to sign. Meanwhile, the search for Martha Higgins continued. Police had initially treated her disappearance as a routine matter, but Isabel refused to leave it at that. Reviewing the dossier until she noticed a handwritten landline number listed on an old notepad page. She dialed the number, and an elderly woman answered, falling silent when Isabel mentioned Martha's name. "I am the child from the clinic that night," Isabel said softly into the receiver. A heavy sigh came over the line, and the woman agreed to meet at a quiet chapel on the outskirts of Elgin, Illinois, asking Isabel to come alone. Despite the risk, Isabel attended the meeting, ensuring her attorney was aware of the location and sharing her live status with Chairman Sterling's team. Inside the quiet chapel, she met an elderly woman named Rosa, Martha Higgins's elder sister. Rosa explained that Martha had spent years living quietly out of fear of individuals connected to Alvin Vance, and that following a recent visit from Mark, Martha had panicked and gone into hiding. However, Rosa produced a sealed envelope Martha had left inside a prayer book, addressed directly to Isabel. The note was brief. "Your mother did not perish in that fire. The fire was set deliberately. I removed you from the nursery, but another woman took you away because men were actively searching for Helena's child." The letter also named a private care facility in rural Wisconsin where an unidentified woman had been placed following the incident, listed under the name Sarah Miller. Records indicated that funding for the facility had been drawn for decades from an entity called Apex Holdings, a firm Isabel's attorney quickly linked to an offshore trust managed directly by Alvin Vance. The revelation was profound. If Sarah Miller was indeed Helena, then Vance had not only concealed her survival from Chairman Sterling, but had actively funded her isolation for nearly 30 years. Overwhelmed by the possibility, Isabel, her attorney, and Chairman Sterling obtained an emergency court order to inspect the Wisconsin facility's intake records. The administrator attempted to delay access, citing patient privacy, but complied when served with the judicial warrant. The historical file confirmed that a patient had been admitted decades ago without formal identification, suffering from trauma and memory loss, with monthly expenses covered by Apex Holdings. When Isabel asked to see the patient, the attending physician cautioned that the woman was fragile and easily overwhelmed by unfamiliar visitors. Isabel looked at the doctor calmly and replied, "She has spent 30 years living without the truth. I will not allow anyone to keep her in the dark any longer." She walked into the quiet sunroom, where an older woman with silver hair sat by the window, her left cheek bearing faint, faded scars. Isabel recognized the eyes immediately from the photograph. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then, Isabel carefully unfastened the gold fleur-de-lis pendant from her neck and held it out. The woman's hands began to tremble the moment her eyes fell upon the gold detail. She reached out, her breath catching as she whispered a single name, Elizabeth. Isabel knelt beside her chair, taking her hands gently as tear rolled down the woman's face. Memories returned in broken fragments. Helena spoke of smoke filling a hallway, a crying infant, and men arguing near the exit. She recalled Martha helping her toward a window and remembered Alvin Vance's voice commanding that the records be cleared. "He took my daughter," Helena said, her voice shaking with long-repressed fear. "He said it was to protect the company." Chairman Sterling, listening from the doorway, stepped into the room, overcome with emotion. Seeing him, Helena shrank back briefly, still carrying the fear of the young woman who had fled her family home decades ago. The chairman stopped in his tracks, asking for her forgiveness without attempting to step closer, while Helena asked quietly what had become of Daniel. The silence in the room provided the answer, as Chairman Sterling gently explained that Daniel had passed away years later, having searched for her relentlessly. To secure their position against Vance's legal maneuvers, Isabel's attorney arranged for an immediate court-supervised DNA collection between Isabel and Helena, while filing an emergency injunction to freeze Apex Holdings' assets. However, news of Helena's location reached Vance's associates quickly, and within hours, local deputies arrived at the facility with an administrative transport order obtained by Mark, claiming the patient needed to be returned to a specialized state facility for her own protection. When the officers entered the room, Helena panicked, clinging to Isabel's arm as memories of her initial removal surfaced. Isabel stood firmly between her mother and the officers, while her attorney contested the validity of the order on the spot. Outside in the parking lot, Mark was waiting beside a dark sedan. Isabel approached him directly, her tone cold and precise. "Is this how far you are willing to go?" Mark maintained his composure, asserting that he was merely preventing a complex corporate dispute from harming a fragile woman. Isabel looked at him with complete clarity and said, "The DNA tests are certified, Mark. It's over." Mark offered a brief, bitter smile and replied, "Certifications can be challenged in court, Isabel. So can the statements of individuals deemed mentally unfit." The comment revealed his strategy entirely. Isabel looked at her husband and asked why he continued to shield Vance, to which Mark replied sharply that she failed to understand the scope of what was at stake, that a multi-billion-dollar corporation could not be placed in the hands of someone with no corporate background. "So that's what my life comes down to for you?" Isabel asked quietly. "A risk to your career?" Mark did not answer directly. He stepped closer and whispered so the deputies could not hear, offering to withdraw the guardianship petition and ensure proper care for Helena if Isabel agreed to sign the representation papers and waive her voting rights. Isabel felt a deep disgust as she realized he was using her mother as leverage. "You aren't trying to protect me, Mark," she said clearly. "You're trying to control me." Isabel was taken to the local station for questioning regarding the alleged unauthorized removal of a patient, but her attorney secured her release within hours without formal charges. Before leaving, she submitted copies of Mark's text messages, the altered documents, and Martha Higgins's letter directly to the state prosecutor's office. Shortly after, the certified results from the Wisconsin facility arrived. The genetic match between Isabel and Helena was confirmed at 99.9%. With the certified report in hand, Isabel felt a deep sense of resolve. Returning to Chicago, she refused Chairman Sterling's offer to stay at his estate, choosing instead to remain at her attorney's apartment to prepare for the upcoming board meeting. "They expect me to hide behind lawyers," Isabel stated. "Instead, we are going to present every piece of evidence publicly." The following morning, Isabel called Mark directly, adopting a quiet, hesitant tone to suggest she was overwhelmed by the legal pressure and ready to discuss a settlement. Mark took the bait immediately, arranging a private meeting at an executive dining club downtown. Unbeknownst to him, Isabel's legal team had secured judicial authorization to record the conversation, with investigators positioned nearby. Mark arrived wearing a tailored suit, offering a relaxed smile as he ordered coffee, and brought up the idea of a peaceful resolution. He explained that if she signed the management agreement, he could ensure her financial security while keeping the Sterling family's corporate disputes out of the press. Isabel kept her answers brief, asking directly what would happen to Helena if she refused. Mark leaned in and made his position explicit, stating that without her cooperation, Helena's legal status would remain tied up in institutional litigation for years, while Chairman Sterling would be removed from his post before any court could review the evidence. "You have a sensible way out of this, Isabel," he said smoothly. "Sign the agreement, take a generous settlement, and let professionals manage the firm." Isabel then produced a copy of the dossier page and asked when he had first learned of her background. Realizing he could no longer deny it, Mark admitted he had known for months, arguing that he had acted to protect their future and ensure he was not pushed aside by the Sterling family. Isabel looked at him and asked quietly if he had ever truly cared for her during their years together. Mark hesitated, admitting that he had loved her in the beginning when they had nothing, but that her sudden connection to the Sterling estate presented an opportunity he could not ignore, a chance to secure a permanent place at the top of the corporate ladder. Isabel then brought up the fire at the medical archive, and Mark grew visibly defensive, claiming he had only hired an agency to retrieve documents and had never intended for any property to be destroyed, inadvertently confirming his involvement in the operation. When Isabel refused to sign the documents on the spot, Mark's composure broke. He grabbed her wrist firmly and warned that if she walked away, he would ensure she was remembered as an unstable impostor. Isabel looked down at his hand, then up at his face, and said calmly, "Do whatever you feel you must, Mark. I am done hiding." Later that afternoon, Alvin Vance convened an emergency meeting of the board of directors to vote on removing Arthur Sterling as chairman on grounds of mismanagement. Evelyn had prepared an internal briefing claiming the company's stock was at risk due to the ongoing dispute, positioning Mark as the stabilizing successor to take over executive operations. However, as the board prepared to vote, the doors to the boardroom opened and Isabel entered alongside her legal team, accompanied by representatives from the state prosecutor's office. The room fell entirely silent as Isabel's attorney presented the certified DNA reports, the original trust documents preserved by Arthur Faraz, and a court order granting Isabel temporary voting authority over the contested share blocks. Alvin Vance attempted to dismiss the filings as fraudulent, but Isabel instructed her team to play the audio recording from the dining club. Mark's voice filled the boardroom, clearly detailing his knowledge of Isabel's background, his attempts to secure her signatures under false pretenses, and his coordination with Vance to keep Helena isolated. As the recording played, several board members shifted away from Mark and Vance. Facing exposure, Mark panicked and turned on Vance directly, asserting that Vance had directed the entire strategy and had arranged the concealment of Helena's records for decades. Vance shouted back, accusing Mark of incompetence for failing to manage his own wife, effectively confirming their collusion in front of the entire corporate leadership. A live video link was then established with a magistrate's office, where Martha Higgins provided sworn testimony regarding the night of the clinic fire and Vance's direct orders to erase Helena's records. To conclude the presentation, Helena herself entered the room in a wheelchair, accompanied by her attending physician. She looked directly at Alvin Vance and spoke clearly. "You took my daughter from me and kept me hidden for 30 years to protect your control over this company. My name is Helena Sterling, and this is my daughter, Elizabeth. The state prosecutors stepped forward, announcing that formal indictments were being issued for fraud, evidence tampering, illegal confinement, and conspiracy. Alvin Vance was taken into custody on the spot, while Mark was escorted from the premises for formal questioning regarding the archive fire. Evelyn attempted to distance herself from her father's actions, but board members immediately voted to suspend her from her post, pending a full internal investigation. As Mark was led past Isabel in the lobby, he stopped and tried to speak, claiming he had been pressured by Vance and had only wanted to build a better future for them. Isabel looked at him without anger, her voice steady. "You didn't need to destroy me to build a life, Mark. You chose to do it because you valued power more than the person who stood by you when you had nothing." Outside the building, a crowd of reporters had gathered. Isabel stepped up to the microphones, refusing to let others dictate the narrative any longer. She announced that she was not there to claim a corporate title or seek vengeance, but to ensure that the truth was fully recognized and that those responsible for decades of deception were held accountable. "For years, I believed I had to apologize for taking up space," she said clearly. "Today, I know that no one needs permission to exist." In the months that followed, the legal proceedings dismantled the network Vance had built. Mark was convicted for his role in the document destruction and attempted fraud, receiving a federal prison sentence that effectively ended his corporate career. Alvin Vance faced severe charges stemming from the original abduction and long-term confinement of Helena, ensuring he would spend the remainder of his life in custody. Evelyn was permanently removed from her position and faced civil liability that wiped out her financial standing. Isabel declined the offer to take over as chief executive officer of the Golden Crest Group, choosing instead to establish an independent oversight committee to ensure corporate transparency. She allocated a portion of her inherited shares to found the Helena and Clara Foundation, an organization dedicated to helping families locate missing children, providing legal assistance to vulnerable mothers, and investigating institutional abuse. Helena moved into a quiet home with a garden on the outskirts of the city, where she slowly rebuilt her life surrounded by support and peace. Chairman Sterling visited regularly, and over time, the deep wounds of the past began to heal, not through dramatic declarations, but through quiet presence, shared meals, and the slow restoration of trust. One quiet evening, Isabel sat on the porch with her mother as the sun set over the garden. Helena reached into her pocket and brought out the gold fleur-de-lis pendant, offering it back to her daughter. Isabel looked at the delicate piece that had brought down a network of lies and reconnected her with her true origins. She fastened the chain around her neck, knowing it no longer represented a painful mystery, but the enduring strength of the women who came before her. She had spent a lifetime searching for a place where she belonged, only to realize that true belonging was not something granted by powerful people in grand ballrooms. It was something she carried within herself the moment she chose to stand in her own truth.